Happy Sabbath, Certus family. It's good to see you. We saw you yesterday, and I hope more people has joined into our small group today. It's our 34th time of studying Genesis, and today's chapter would be Genesis 46. We skipped a few chapters, Genesis 46 and to 47 till verse 12 of 47. So it's beginning of 46 until the middle of 47, which is verse 12. It is pretty long passage, and I do not want you to go through all of that with all of your group members. Just skim through it. It is a story of Joseph having a reunion with his family, especially with his father Jacob in the land of Egypt. So they have a brief explanation of which families are coming into the land of Egypt and how the reunion was taking place on the end of 46 and the beginning of 47. So as we all see, Joseph is having a reunion with his family. After all, after that 20, 30 years, now Joseph sees his family, especially he sees his father being alive. So now he's inviting all the families over to the land of Goshen and introducing them to the king of Pharaoh of Egypt, introducing them as the shepherds and as their own family. There was an interesting part from verse 10 and 11, that which is that Jacob is giving a blessings, having a prayer of a blessing to the king of the Egypt, and also that the Pharaoh of Egypt is actually letting them stay in the best part of the land. I believe it was verse 11 and 12, which intrigues my curiosity because they are just immigrating into the land and they were the movers. However, the king of Egypt was giving them the best part of the land, which was Goshen, which was not really understandable for me. So our big question starts from today. How were they able to live in the land of Goshen where it was the best part? It was the milk and honey land, right? There could be many reasons that we can see how it was possible for these occasion. Well, maybe Joseph was a great prime minister. That could be one of the reasons. But after all, I want to see God's providence as a first reason for that. God's providence. About 200 years ago, about 3 generations ahead, this was a covenant that God was giving to Abraham. Says, I will give you more descendants that is bigger and more numerous than the stars in the heaven. That was the initial promise that was given as a covenant to Abraham. And then comes down to Isaac and Jacob and now Joseph, seeing them still living in the land of Canaan, we wouldn't still count them as numerous as the stars in the heaven. They were pretty big, but not close as having their own country or as the stars in the heaven. When you count the stars in the heaven, it is pretty a lot of numbers. And if you have that much for your people and your families, you would be able to have your own country to be established. However, them still living in the land of Canaan, they were not really being in a situation to build up a country for themselves. They were not as big. For say, God's covenant and God's promise were not yet fulfilled in the family of Jacob and Joseph. Because also in the land of Canaan, there were many more tribes who were stronger and who were more fearful than the family clans of Joseph. So in order for them to kind of grow and multiply in the land of Canaan, it was not a right situation, even with the food and even with the situation being encircled in with a lot more stronger tribes. So in order for them to fulfill the promise that was given by God, they had to move somewhere where they can have a right protection and also get some enough food for them to enoughly multiply themselves and to get to have some numbers as much as the numbers in the stars as stars. And as the prophets and patriarchs and prophet says, Egypt, however, offered the conditions necessary to fulfillment of the divine purpose. A section of country well watered and fertile was open to them there, affording every advantage for their speedy increase. And now seeing that, it was for sure better land than the land of Egypt, therefore for them to fulfill the multiplying, because they had enough food, they had a protection from Egypt. They were in a safe, good milk and honey land for them to actually make it the reality of God's providence, right? There's a book called Archaeology in Old Testament. It also says about how it was possible for them and how it was also different for them to go into the land of Goshen and how it was different from the land of Canaan. It says Goshen contained good pasture land. And there, the family could approximate part of the lifestyle, the heart they had known in Palestine. It was about the same, but there were a little bit of differences they had. There, they found some differences from the life they had known. One major difference was the manner of travel, which was now easier in the land of Goshen and the land of Egypt. The hills and valleys of central Palestine kept them to sometimes meandering rich routes, whereas in the flat plain of Goshen, they could travel in a more direct line. In Palestine, they would have traveled by foot or donkey. But in the delta, whereas the land of Goshen, a boat ride was also an option. So they would also encounter a greater fluctuation in the yearly temperatures. Now, looking at the land of Goshen is the northern part of Egyptian kingdom, which is closer to the delta area, which is closer to the river, also a sea. So for them, it was more like a plain. So whatever they're planning to do, they were doing the flocks, they were a shepherd, but also if they were planning to do having a what is 농사? I'm sorry, I always forget the word. 농사, if they were to grow the rice, wheats, and everything, it was the best situation for them as well, right? And as they were having a fluctuation, meaning as time varies in 1 year, they were having more water period, they were having a less water period. But when they were having more water, it was a better situation for them to actually have a better crops, right? So this is a little different from what they were having from Palestine back in Canaan. However, it was in a better way, in a sense. So they were able to move into the land of Goshen by God's providence. And secondly, I would like to combine their human efforts with God's providence. There is a great phrase that I always like to add on, which is when we combine God's divine ability, God's providence, and human efforts together, there is a great miracle that can ever taken place by Ellen White's writing. For them, they say there's an interesting part where they say their occasion is especially shepherds, right? At this part, Joseph is urging or explaining to them that they should claim themselves as a shepherd, not only by themselves, but also by generational occasion was the shepherd, which is right. But Joseph is asking his families, when you encounter Pharaoh and on that place, you should say the shepherd is your own occasion. And there is a little bit of an explanation by the Bible on the Bible that says, and the shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Look at this. I was wondering why was Joseph making up some well, he was not making up. Well, why would he emphasize that they were the shepherds? Was it for his people to go into the land of Goshen because they were doing the shepherd, they were doing the flocks, or was there any special reason? Right? And then after that, Pharaoh is actually giving them the land of Goshen, the best part of the land, for them to do the flocks, the shepherd job. And Bible says, okay, it was detestable to the Egyptians, the occasion of the shepherd. And there were multiple reasons for that. Because Egyptian people they were having multiple gods in their religion, and most of them, when we imagine how they were looking like, it mostly looked like an animal. They had a head of an animal, they had a head of a bird, and their body was kind of human, but then their head was mostly like an animal, which means that they were also deifying, they were worshiping animals in their religion. So whenever they saw someone who was stealing or mostly killing an animal as their job, like shepherd, mostly shepherd, they would hate those kind of job, even though they needed it. That was the first reason. And the second reason is more of a bigger reason that I see from here. They had a memory of an invasion by the people who was a shepherd. Remember, I once studied, like we once studied about which kind of dynasty it was back then where Joseph was being enthroned to the prime minister, position of prime minister. It was the Hyksos dynasty. There has been many dynasties throughout Egyptian kingdom. However, Hyksos dynasty is pretty unique in a way that they come from the land of Canaan, right? So who is Hyksos? This wall painting is from explaining where or who the Hyksos was. The Hyksos people, they are coming from the land of Canaan. For them, the two distinctive features for Egyptians to see Hyksos was, number one, the flocks, the shepherds. So they were having these like sheeps, horses, donkeys. So when you see actually the picture, the babies, they're riding on a donkey, sometimes a horse, and they're also having a sheep and a goat. So for them, number one feature for Hyksos was the shepherds. They were the shepherds. So they would have a memory of the Hyksos dynasty invading into the land of their own Egyptian kingdom and them actually getting the throne for themselves. Now the pharaoh was also a Hyksos. So this Hyksos dynasty was not a good memory. That's not the best memory for the Egyptians to remember. However, I want you to also focus on the clothes they're wearing on right now. These Hyksos people, what are they wearing right now? They're wearing something different than the real Egyptians were wearing on. It says, when Egyptians saw the Hyksos people, they saw them with the colored garments. Number one feature was that they were shepherds, and number two feature was that they were wearing, the Hyksos people were wearing the colored garments. Doesn't it kind of look similar how Joseph was wearing his own clothes, a colored robes, right? So we can 99% say that the Hyksos dynasty, that these people come from the same region and same culture that Joseph and his people, his families were living in the land of Canaan, which also speaks the same language, which is also explainable to Joseph being enthroned in the position of prime minister, because even though he was a slave, and even though he was in captive into a prison, still he was being able to enthrone upwards radically because he was having the same cultural background to the Hyksos dynasty. Which also explains later on, when 100 years later, when Joseph was gone and when the new pharaoh out of Hyksos dynasty, when the Hyksos dynasty was kicked out later on, they were kicked out by the real Egyptians, right? And then they kicked out the Hyksos dynasty, and the real pharaoh, who was born as a real Egyptian pharaoh, right? His bloodline was Egyptian, and he started suffering these Israelites in the Goshen land. Whereas contrast, when we see the Hyksos pharaoh was in favored the Israelites, the family of Joseph. But later on, 100 years later, when the pharaoh, who doesn't know about Joseph, he actually suffers and tortures the Israelites. So it's kind of explainable how these people, the same from Canaan, the Canaanites were favoring each other in the land of Egypt, but later on, they were remembering the bad memory of the shepherd, which is the Canaanites, the Hyksos people, and then start torturing the Israelites. Per se, coming back to the story, they came to the land of Goshen, and then they chose to live a life that was detestable by Egyptian people. They actively made a decision to get the occasion or occupation, a job that were detestable to Egyptian people. And I started wondering, why did they really choose that? Was it just because they wanted to live in the land of Goshen? Or was there any more reasons for them to leave as like that? Ellen White also gives a better explanation of how or why they had to have an occupation of shepherd. And the antipathy they must encounter in Egypt on account of their occupation. For every shepherd was an abomination unto the Egyptians, would enable them to remain a distinct and a separate people, and would thus serve to shut them out from participation in the idolatry of Egypt. The very reason why they had to do the job of shepherd, sometimes get discriminated by the real Egyptians, was because in order to do so, they were able to live a distinct and a separate life that was separate from the Egyptians' idolatry life. And also, they were able to keep their identity. And when they were coming out of Egypt later on, like 400 years later, when they're on an exodus, it was easier for them to get out because they were not really mingled with the Egyptians, with their culture, with their idolatry, with their race. If they were intermingled with the real Egyptians, with the religion and with the culture, well, later on they partly do because they lived there for like 400 years. So they partly do, but if they were wholly intermingled with Egyptian people, it would be hard for them to actually get out of that Egyptian country and to go the journey of Exodus. It was better for them to stay distinctive and separate somewhat from the society, even though they were getting a little bit of a discrimination, right? And this reminded me of the story of the first immigrant generation in the States as well. The first generation and second generation, third generation sometimes. They come here in the United States and they lived their own first generational job. Sometimes they do setakso, sometimes they do some of the jobs other Americans wouldn't actually do. They get all the discrimination, they get all the insults, sometimes some of the racism. They all endure all of that for a second and third generation, their offsprings, to live a better life. However, coming to second, third generation, which is all of us right now, asking then, is it a better life than a first generation? Would we live, or are we living a perfectly 100% American life? We might doubt. Because even though we are second and third generation living here, somewhat part of our culture, somewhat part of our gene says we're still somewhat Korean. So they ask, are we Korean or are we American? Or are we just Korean American? Well, it is Korean American, partly Korean, partly American. It is pretty distinctive from Koreans, and it also pretty distinctive from Americans as well. We cannot really perfectly intermingle into one of both. Then how shall we ought to live today? Just like Israelites, the family of Joseph, should we live in the land of Goshen? Should we live in the kingdom of Egypt, just like how we're going to live, not live forever, but to leave in few years? For Israelites, they lived for 100 years in the land of Egypt, but then they were always getting ready to get out of that land because they had one hope, that we are going to make it back to the land of Canaan, their promised land. Then should we live like Israelites, like we live in the States, but we should get ready to go back to Korea in a few years later? No. I don't think so. I don't think that's the relatable lesson we can get from here. The relatable lesson we can get from here is that we live here as a heavenly descendants. So we live as a citizen of the United States. We live here as a citizen of this American continent. But when Jesus comes again, we should get ready to go back to heavenly kingdom, not to the land of Korea, but the land of heavenly kingdom. I think that is a good way for us to remain as a Korean American, also as an Adventist. Sometimes if you say you're a Korean American, there could be some racism or there could be some of the discrimination that are from the society itself. But again, seeing the culture of Israelites living there in the land of Goshen, discrimination could be one way of us to keep our identity as an SDA and as a Korean American as well. So if you are experiencing some of that, well, I can't say do not worry about it, but also I can say that there could be some way how God is planning our way with his providence. So I am really happy for the atmosphere that we are building together in Church of Cerritos, because I feel like this is the good way of how to experience the heavenly kingdom within our land as well. So when Jesus comes again, let this atmosphere that we have in Cerritos be the atmosphere in the heavenly kingdom as well. I really welcome you again with our discussion today. So as you go into a discussion, I want you to really open up when you are growing up in the States or when you are growing up in Korea and coming to States. Open up your experiences and let the Holy Spirit be with us tonight when we discuss about it. Okay, it's good to talk to you. Also, I'll see you. I hope to see you tomorrow as well. You have a happy and blessed Sabbath. Thank you all.